There are few decisions that will be more influential on people's day-to-day lives than migration. Many historical populations settled across the world in different regions. Some of these populations were fairly isolated from one another for tens of thousands of years. These historical populations have different ancestral backgrounds, each with different genetics, heritage, and culture. Today, I'm going to talk about all of these. To be better informed when making migration policy decisions, it's important that a society thinks about these factors and differences and takes them into account. Starting with ancestry. Naturally, you generally have some of your closest relationships with your direct family. You wouldn't exist if it wasn't for your parents. You likely saw your siblings every single day when you were growing up. You're part of the same family and bloodline. This connection and relationship to your direct family can also extend to your indirect family, like your uncles, aunts, and cousins. You are descendants from the same bloodline. You might share some of the same stories about your grandparents, and you have potentially adopted some of their habits, traditions, morals, or values. This bloodline and ancestry can also be highly similar with other people around you who could also be descendants from the same population. You might have shared the same environment and had some of the same lived experiences with these people that you share an ancestry with over generations. These connections and relationships between people lead to the creation of naturally forming in-groups and out-groups. If you have more in common with people that share your own ancestry, it is more likely that you will be closer to this group than others that you don't. This reality of there being similarities and differences can mean it isn't very surprising when you see families that prefer to live close together, which also can extend to a preference to live amongst similar communities that share the same ancestry and background. This is one of many factors that can increase the possibility of the creation of ethnic enclaves in a multicultural society. It's easier to share commonalities with people who have a similar ancestry and background to yourself. So, this is a relevant factor for migration policy, as you need to think about the situations where the ancestry and background of a population is vastly different than the current population. What allegiances could exist between these migrant communities and their ancestral homeland, and how that could be problematic if those ties could influence political outcomes. Genetics is another really important area where differences exist between populations. When you look at different populations from across the world, you can quickly start to spot genetic differences. We are not all equally the same, we don't look the same, we have different physical traits, and we also seem to have varying levels of general intelligence. These genetic differences exist within populations, and also between different distinct population groups. Many populations that settled in different regions across the world were often isolated from other populations for tens of thousands of years. This is enough time for evolutionary differences to emerge due to their environment. When considering migration policy, a few key areas that will be relevant surrounding genetics will include things like physical traits and intelligence. There are many reasons why a person might decide to date certain groups of people over others. Physical traits are just one of many reasons. Any individual may find certain physical traits more attractive than others, such as hair, eyes, skin color, shape, and size. Some people may prefer to date others that have similar physical traits. It's not that uncommon for some people to prefer that their children will look like them. And this choice is absolutely fine. Who they date is completely up to them. If this preference is true at the individual level, then it is also interesting to understand this preference at the collective level. If the majority of people don't want to date and have children with certain populations due to different physical traits or appearances, then this could represent another contributing factor towards increasing segregation. These preferences might make it harder to create a highly integrated society if these populations prefer to date amongst themselves, and that contributes towards communities living separately. Another genetic factor to consider is intelligence. For some people, this is a delicate topic, but it's still a really important factor to think about. If you look at the distribution of IQ scores across different countries, you generally see a correlation with higher average IQ scores and how developed the society is. Generally speaking, the lower the average IQ, the less developed the society. Of course, some exceptions can exist. Sometimes a more intelligent society could still be struggling due to governments and poor decision making. and lower average IQ societies could still be highly prosperous, and that may be because of things like a booming tourism industry due to their country having a lot of natural beauty. Intelligence isn't a simple topic, and the accuracy of the national IQ scores and the observations that get made using this data are regularly contested. One of the arguments around intelligence is that the environment can play a meaningful role in determining IQ, but it's also accepted that genetics will also clearly play an important contributing factor. The real question is, to what extent is genetics more important than the environment? This is basically the nature versus nurture argument. Research suggests that intelligence could be anywhere from 50% up to around 80% genetically inherited. And if it is the case that it is 80% inherited, importing people from lower average IQ countries could pose a risk to more developed countries. They could be creating an environment where their average IQ is dropping each year depending on the intelligence of the migrants they are inviting in. If the hypothesis that intelligence and IQ is generally correlated with the prosperity of a society is correct, then it could potentially result in some societies becoming less stable and prosperous over time if their population's average IQ keeps declining. The topic of intelligence and its impact on society and migration deserves its own video. I'll make a video very soon. However, for now, I can share a number of resources in the description that are worth taking a look at on the topic of intelligence. From what I've seen so far, I do think intelligence is an important factor, and any differences should be taken into account. Hoping that the environment will mean the differences in intelligence are actually negligible doesn't seem very compelling. Reducing some of the IQ gaps by changing the environment is one thing. However, reducing them to the point where there are no longer any differences is entirely different. Let's now think about heritage. The heritage of each population is another difference that deserves some thought. Populations will hand down a number of things between generations. For now, we're just going to focus on the more physical things. Each generation will pass down things like infrastructure, artifacts, and monuments. These assets can often have a lot of meaning to these communities whose ancestry is responsible for their creation. The problem to consider with migration is that people from different ancestral backgrounds don't have the same connection to these assets. So, if a new migrant population has an increasing amount of authority and influence in these societies, there could be less of a concern around the degradation or replacement of these historical assets. Some new populations may even prefer to repurpose these historical assets for a different use case. They'd be perfectly entitled to do so in a democracy, but that might not have been what the historical population wanted to happen. This is why you need to think about these things ahead of time. Demographics are destiny when you give migrants voting power. If the historical population wanted to better protect their heritage, they would need to be concerned with the ancestral background of the people in that society and how they are connected with the heritage that is being passed down through each generation. They also want to think about who has power in the country and how that could influence future priorities and decisions around maintaining and protecting these assets. Finally, we definitely need to talk about culture. Culture is another really important area when considering the differences between different societies. Culture is relevant to and also a part of heritage. Generations will pass down things to their children and the wider community, such as traditions, rituals, festivals, performing arts, music, dance, and so on. There are so many things that are involved in culture. Language, how people greet each other, humor, storytelling, gestures, eye contact, facial expressions, touch, and personal space. There's also hospitality, gift-giving, punctuality, queuing norms, core values and morals, and attitudes towards authority or risk-taking. Our belief systems are another huge part of culture, religions, mythologies, rituals, taboos, and afterlife beliefs. You also see different work habits and work ethics. Different cultures have different levels of ambition and focus on entrepreneurship and innovation. There can be differences in family structures, courtship and dating, gender roles, whether you have kids or not, and how many kids you're likely going to have. Recreation, games, sports, and cuisine. There are so many things related to culture. If you invite people into a society that come from another culture, it's difficult to expect them to learn and embrace a new culture in a short period of time. Even after a long period of time, it can be difficult to fully integrate into the culture exactly. Migrants won't necessarily agree with the norms, values, and everything else that the current population embraces in their own culture. There will also generally be differences in how one person assimilates compared to another. A number of people won't want to abandon their own culture. That's part of their identity. So you can easily imagine how importing a large number of people can easily lead to the creation of friction between different cultures and the potential creation of parallel societies that maintain their own distinct culture. The larger the amount and the depth of these differences between any two cultures, the more risk there is that there could be disagreement and conflict. This becomes increasingly important if demographics are changing and new cultures are morphing or replacing the existing one. If the original population never wanted this to happen, they need to be able to express that in a democratic way so they can correct the issue through migration policy changes. An important factor on this topic of culture is the fact that new and expanding cultures might not be better than the existing culture. You may even be able to prove that parts of the incoming culture are undesirable in numerous ways. An example of that could be first cousin marriages. Inbreeding can increase the absolute risk of certain recessive disorders, which could include a reduction in general levels of intelligence. This outcome can obviously be a burden for society, as these children could become fully dependent on their parents as well as the state to help look after them. The host population needs to be able to identify and express their preferences on these cultural differences before you invite those cultures into your society. Setting aside international responsibilities like refugee responsibilities, any society is entitled to reject migration from populations that they would prefer to not live with due to their own preferences. It's one thing to say, I respect your choice to practice something different in your own society. It's another to be expected to allow a very different culture into your own society. That is a very different proposition, and one that could be highly problematic over the long term. The choice of what a society wants to accept culturally is up to the ancestral and native population. Hopefully, this was useful for understanding the huge amount of differences that can exist between different societies. Ancestry, genetics, culture, and heritage are not the same between populations and societies. It's not sensible to simply ignore these differences. The larger the differences between these populations, the more likely it becomes that parallel communities could start to form, or that disputes and problems emerge. If a society wants to prevent this from happening, they'll need to at least consider these differences when making any migration policy decisions. All humans should be treated with dignity and respect. However, societies also need to be able to talk about these differences and then decide themselves whether they want to invite any migrants into their own communities or not. If they do, they then need to decide which populations they are willing to invite based on their preferences and their understanding of the differences. These decisions are going to have a huge influence on how a society functions, how it changes over time, and how it maintains or evolves its ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. Next up, we're going to talk about the democratic breeding and migration game.